Hello and welcome back to the competitive biography of Emanuel Lasker. In the previous video, we introduced Jacques Mieses and showed off a casual game the two played together back in October, and now we're going to jump right into the match that they played later in December. Let's get into it. Mieses' visit to Berlin in October seemed to inspire him, as later in the year he sent out a challenge to any of the Berlin masters offering to play a match in the city of Leipzig, where Mieses is from. Naturally, as we can see, Lasker took up the challenge. One very large difference between this match and the previous events that Lasker has played were the stakes. Mieses asked for a stake of 450 German marks. Now, for a rough translation, 20 German marks was worth 1 British pound at the time, so you can use that for conversion if you want. Regardless, this was a very large sum for Lasker specifically. For winning the Hauptturnier, he got 300 marks, and second place at the Amsterdam 1889 tournament was 225 marks. So this was more than he could afford alone. And indeed, this was generally how matches were played and funded back in the day, was that the players wouldn't put up the funds, but rather they would find backers. They would find people who assumed they would win, would more or less bet on them, and would put forth the prize fund for the winners. Now, generally how it works was that Lasker specifically had a contract where the backers would get 50% and he would get 50% of the prize fund if he were to win. And of course, if he lost, he would lose everything. So for a mathematical example, the stake being 450 marks here, if Lasker were to win, his backers would get their 450 back, and then the 450 that Mieses would put up would be split half and half between Lasker and his backers. Simple enough, I'd like to believe. Anyway, Lasker was indeed able to find backers for this match. We will see later on that there will be some trouble with the finances, and indeed there have been many cases historically of matches not coming to fruition because of finances and lack of backers and such. But in this case, we didn't have to worry about that. Lasker was able to find all of the money he needed. So on Mieses' invitation, he traveled up to Leipzig to play their match. Some quick logistics before we get started. The first two games of this match took place in the final 2 days of December, with the rest going on into the parts of January 1890, so we're going to be going ahead a year. The time control was 20 moves per hour, as was standard in this part of the world, and the format was, as you can see below the camera, first to 5 wins. That's all we really need to talk about for now. If anything important comes up, I will of course include it in subsequent videos, but for now, let's get to the start of this most important match between Emanuel Lasker and Jacques Mieses. Lasker won the drawing of colors, so he was able to start with the white pieces, and for the opening move of this opening game, Lasker decided to play the move d4. Mieses gives us our first look at a new opening for us, the Dutch defense with f5, and after c4, he goes immediately out of theory entirely, does Mieses, by playing the move c5, already a move that has basically never been played. e6 is the most popular move here, and the commentators gave this as best, and black is able to continue with a very straightforward development plan of knight f6, bishop e7, castles, and things along those lines. But c5 was played here, and we reach a position that had only been played once before this game. Now in that other game, the player behind the white pieces chose for a somewhat tame setup with e3, e6, knight to f3, knight to f6, bishop to d3, knight to c6, castles, and so on. Very straightforward moves here. This was played between the Britishman Cecil de Vere and the Frenchman Jules Arnaud de Rivière at the Paris 1867 tournament. De Vere would go on to win this game with white. The commentators here believed that the move d5 was the best move here, and interestingly enough, this actually puts us in a position that's reached generally via a different move order. If black decides to play the old Benoni with c5 on move 1, after d5, f5 is technically a move here. This is called the Mujana formation, apparently named after a similar sort of setup played in Shatranj, which is the 2-player version of Chaturanga, one of the games considered to be one of the precursors to chess. In this position, c4 is a relatively common move, and we reach the same position as we would in the game. But Lasker decided to go the most direct route here and played d captures on c5. This is a novelty, and so it is as of move 3 that the players are playing a unique game. Now Mieses decided that he wanted to regain his pawn right away, so he played the move queen to a5 check. Commentators were somewhat split over this move. e6 is the usual move in these, I don't want to call it a Benoni structure, but it's kind of in that ballpark. This is the move you of course want to be regaining the pawn with the bishop. This move was endorsed by the Germans and condemned by the English. Now, the justification, of course, is that if white just plays normal moves like knight f3, we're going to regain the pawn here on c5, e3, knight to f6, black's going to castle next, and we get a reasonably fine position. So the question is, can you defend this pawn as white? Well, d4 is, queen to d4, I should say, is refuted by the Germans pretty straightforwardly, knight to c6, and there's not too much more to write about it. b4 is the move given by the English, and this is why they say e6 is a bad move. And while they have a whole line that they go into to try to justify it, I'm not going to show it because they completely miss the fact that queen to f6 simply picks up the rook in the corner, so this is just a complete non-starter. So I would have to say overall that I agree with the Germans that e6 is a completely reasonable move to play in this position. But okay, Mieses played the move queen to a5 check, Lasker blocked with knight to c3, and after queen captures on c5, e4 came. This f-pawn is here with the sole purpose of ensuring that white can't push e4 safely, so f captures on e4 was played, knight captures on e4, and Mieses retreated his queen back to c7. Now, objectively, this opening is entirely successful for Lasker. Mieses has moved his queen 3 times in only 6 moves, has no means to develop either of his bishops, and on top of that, he has the worst pawn structure. Still, I think, I say very unassuredly, that his goal was to get a wide open position where he can outcalculate Lasker in the upcoming complications. I'm somewhat of the opinion that Mieses was a completely attacking player. He had basically no care for any of the positional nuances. And so it wouldn't be unlike him to go for a completely wild position and simply try to catch Lasker in some sort of calculation battle. We'll see how well that pans out. Lasker continues his development by playing knight to h3, and after g6, the knight goes to f4. Now this knight is coming to d5, and it's going to be very annoying. There isn't really a good way to stop this here as black. If you play e6, directly taking control of the d5 square, white's just going to play queen to d4. This more or less forces e5, and now the knight comes to d5 anyways. You can't take the queen because the black queen falls with check and you lose the rook, and overall black is just not having a good time. So Mieses simply continued with bishop to g7, allowing knight to d5 and putting his queen back on its starting square, d8. Now here Lasker played the very energetic move bishop to g5, offering up the b2 pawn. Now the question, of course, we have to ask ourselves, is this pawn safe to take? The answer is yes, in the sense that black is really going to be having trouble defending regardless, so they might as well suffer for something. Lasker's next threat can be directly stopped by playing the move d6 instead, though it's still all in favor of white because c5 is coming, the bishop has been opened up, c captures on d6 is going to be annoying the black king much more than it's going to be annoying the white king, and overall black is probably going to have a hard time defending the upcoming attack. So Mieses chose to capture the pawn on b2 and told Lasker, bring it on. Bring it on he did. Knight to d6 with check. Of course this pawn is pinned, so king to f8 is forced. Queen to f3 check. And now black has to make a decision how they want to block this check. If you played knight to f6, this loses very quickly to bishop h6 check, king to g8, rook to b1, and wherever you move this bishop, let's put it on e5, knight captures on c8. The poor queen is overloaded, they cannot take the knight as the e7 pawn falls with check, and black just loses material for nothing. Simple as that. Mieses chose correctly, he played bishop back to f6, and now we get some exchanges. Bishop captures f6, knight captures f6, knight captures f6, and e captures on f6. And now queen to d5, threatening absolutely nothing at all. I don't know what you're talking about. Mieses, of course, blocked this by playing queen to e7 with check, and after king to d2, his king escaped to g7. Lasker continued attacking with rook to e1, and Mieses moved his queen back to f8. Now here, Lasker decides to go for a very interesting move, which I am fully in support of, h4. The move rook to e8 is good enough as well, if you want to simply win the queen for the 2 pieces. Follow this up with something like bishop to d3, the other rook is coming to e1, and white is completely winning, black has absolutely nothing developed, but Lasker's move is much more interesting. So, h4. h5 would of course be a very annoying threat to meet for black, so he plays it himself, but now rook to h3. The knight is finally developed to c6, and Lasker plays the move rook h to e3. So this is a very nice way to double up rooks and get them both into the game. Now this is Mieses' 20th move, so after this we reach the time control, and so it's not too much of a surprise that his move queen to d8 is strictly speaking a blunder. In fact, here Lasker has a forced checkmate in 6, so you know the drill. Pause the video, see if you can find the checkmate for Lasker. The first move is probably going to be pretty easy, the second one might take a little bit more to justify. Alright, 3, 2, 1. The checkmate starts in a pretty straightforward fashion, queen to f7 with check, but after king to h6 you need to be a little bit more careful. The commentators of the day gave the move knight to f5 check, which definitely still wins, but it's not as forced mate. G captures f5, and now rook to g3 threatens a mate this way. You can block with the rook here, but you're just giving up a rook for nothing. And if queen to a5 check, you're going to run out of checks pretty quickly. King to d1, queen to a4, king to c1. There are no more checks, and black is going to get checkmated very shortly. However, there is a faster route. Here, white can force the checkmate by playing the move that the commentators all missed. Queen captures on g6 with check. Very beautiful stuff. We love a good queen sacrifice around here. After king captures g6 and rook to g3 with check, black has two options. If king to h6, then knight to f5 check. King to h7 and rook to g7 is checkmate. Simple enough. And if you go back to h7, then finally this bishop gets into the game. Bishop to d3 check. After one block, the king is forced down to h6, and now we get a beautiful royal fork, knight to f7, forking everything, and delivering checkmate. Very good stuff all around. Unfortunately for us, Lasker did not play queen to f7 check. Here he decided to go for the material with rook to e8, which is good enough, I guess. Rook captures e8 and rook captures e8. Now queen to a5 with check is forced, otherwise white is simply going to give checkmate. Queen captures a5, knight captures a5, rook captures c8, rook captures c8, and knight captures c8. So at the end of the line, Lasker is just up a piece, and there's really nothing more to talk about. Mieses could have resigned here and it all would have been fine. He didn't, unfortunately. The game doesn't last too much longer, so let's get through it real quick. Knight to c6, defending the pawn, knight to d6 and b6, bishop to e2, f5, and bishop to f3. Of course, you don't want to get rid of this knight, so knight to e7, and now knight to b5. a5 keeps the pawn safe, and now the knight goes up to c7. Here comes knight to c8 from Mieses, and now this knight sets itself up on d5. Both players activate their kings with king to f7, king to c3, king to e6, king to d4, and Mieses puts his pawn on a dark square with d6. Knight to f4 here from Lasker. This king goes to f6, and now bishop to b7, poking the knight. The knight goes over to a7, and finally we get one more fork with knight to d5 with check, king to e6, and knight captures on b6. And it was here on move 37 that at long last, Jacques Mieses resigned the game. Now I wish I could sing Lasker's praises, that this was a very nice attacking game, sort of in a similar fashion as I did in the previous. I really don't think I can. I mean, if we go back to this position, okay, if Lasker had found queen to f7 and queen captures on g6, then we would certainly be able to have a discussion. But as it stands, rook to e8 was just such a butcher move to finish this game that I don't really think that it's deserving of too much praise. And most of this comes from the fact that Mieses played an absolutely horrible opening. I think if we go back as early as like move 6, I think at this point Mieses isn't objectively lost, but I think he's just strategically busted. And so Lasker not winning this game would have been a bigger deal than him winning this game in this sort of almost brilliant, but really not quite there fashion. But regardless of mine or anyone else's feelings on the quality of the game, that is indeed the first game of the match between Lasker and Mieses. The second game will be coming out soon, which will take place on New Year's Eve of 1889, so we got more chess to look forward to. I look forward to seeing you there, so until then.